Morning. I also turned 17 last week, so to have two prodigies in the room is a rare gift for you all. I have essentially a 10-minute rant that I assumed I would be delivering to more males, so it's the one time that the bias of the audience has actually worked against me. But I did want to touch upon, I suppose, gender specifically, in terms of some of the opportunity there, but also some of the elements where organisations are failing. I think the common speaker trait at the moment is to go, gender or diversity isn't a problem, it's an opportunity. And whilst that's true, I think we also, by using language like that, fade away or ignore the fact that it's also a disgrace. So if you look at some of the statistics that you see now that are produced, if you look at PwC were mentioned earlier, and I know that PwC's defence or explanation for the variance in BAME pay was that it's not that they get paid less so much as the fact they're in more junior jobs, which is probably closer to the sense of cause of that issue, but remains an issue. And I suppose the only thing that I would add to the list of traits that we kind of looked at earlier is also socioeconomic diversity. I think is going to be a key one to look at. Where do we hire from? Are we hiring from people, I know we're in Cambridge, are we hiring from people who went to the right universities, have the right accents, or are we genuinely embracing diversity in terms of talent and opportunity? But I wanted to primarily look at diversity in terms of gender, specifically because I have a 7-year-old daughter. And the refrain when you talk about having a daughter as a man at the moment is, oh, so that's the only reason that you care about these issues, is it? Well, do you know what? It's not a bad reason to care about the issues. So I always think that's an unfair challenge, that I'm not a woman and therefore I shouldn't care. She's 7-year-old and she gets up in the morning each day and I hear her say, Alexa, play Taylor Swift. Now, I am delighted that she has that kind of interaction with technology, but I'm also scared at the fact that every day she barks an order to something called Alexa that's female in all of its traits and responses, and she never says thank you or has to. If Alexa was called Steve, I'd probably feel slightly more comfortable with the next generation of technology, but it's not. We still have outmoded stereotypes and views of women in servile positions, women as essentially electronic PAs now, that support us in our lives, but not in the top jobs. So we saw the composition earlier of a board that will be driving forward thinking in this area, exclusively male, and you wonder how in this day and age you still get to that position. You wonder what the thought process is that sit behind it. So you all work in organisations, I assume, or if you work for yourself, you'll have a view on this. But to what extent, I suppose I'm going to ask for hands up in the room, who is confident that they've absolutely got the gender pay in their organisation completely nailed? Sweet, excellent. That gives me something to go with. There's some over here which heartens me. And what I would suggest is, whilst not descending on them like hawks, please do find them afterwards and say, what are you doing that's right or wrong? My selected reading that I would suggest for people who attend today is, if you'd like to think about the education system in the future, read Ready Player One, which is a kind of sci-fi novel, but very much deals with the future of education. If you would like to think harder about diversity in organisations, there's a book called The Y-Axis, W-H-Y axis, by a gentleman called Uri Nizi, who's an Israeli behavioural economist who looks very much at the issues that contribute to a lack of equality in organisations. And I want to talk specifically about a couple, the first of which is confidence, which was mentioned earlier. So we know from a whole bank of research, and we've done some research at the CIPD, which is called a Head for Hiring, that there are issues in terms of the way that job adverts are constructed. There are issues in the way that people select people for jobs, and that is exacerbated by most of the traditional processes that we have in place. We also know that because of gendered job advertising, where words used are often male, because they're written by males, women are less confident in applying for jobs. They're less confident in applying for jobs where they don't meet all the essential criteria. Whereas men tend to go, well, I met a few of the essential criteria, I may as well give it a punt, which is remarkably entrepreneurial when you think of it, but actually when that plays out across an economy, it's hugely dangerous. So I was speaking to a senior headhunter recently, and he said he used to take 4 or 5 times as many calls to persuade a woman to go for another opportunity at a senior level than it would to a man. Now, that's a volume industry to a degree, so what he found was he was more often placing male candidates than female candidates. Now that's a confidence issue that strikes to the very composition of organisations at the highest level. Because if you move about more in your career, you tend to get to more senior positions. That's the way how organisations work. And at the same time, when you're moving about, you tend to get a pay bump. And research shows that women as a whole tend to be less effective at negotiating salaries. And there's a couple of things that sit within that. The first of which is if a man sees a £30,000 on a job advert, we see that as the starting point for negotiations. If a woman sees it, they see that as the salary for the role. And over time, if people go into similar roles, the men are always getting £1,000, £2,000 more. And then the following year, they get a 2% increase on that £1,000 that they claim more. In time in the economy, that creates huge amounts of disparity. And that's a challenge. And so my call out to organisations is to stop thinking as though you're operating in a purely capitalist system, which we are to a degree, but start thinking about how you want to reward talent in the round. Because there is a fundamental difference between paying people what you think you can get away with paying people and paying people what you think they deserve. And part of that difference manifests itself in the pay gap that we have in this country. Women are prepared to accept less. Women are used to accepting less. So organisations pay them less. And when we've paid them less, they then negotiate less well for their next salary increase. Or even worse, when men go in and say, I'd like to be paid more money, we go, what a go-getter. And when a woman goes in and says, I'd like to be paid more money, we think of them as bossy, or we think of them as aggressive, or we think of them as needy. And they're horrible stereotypes, but they absolutely exist and perpetuate in organisations now in this day and age. So I come back to the start of this, which is I have a 7-year-old daughter. And all of you in this room run organisations, and some of those organisations, if not all of them, will go on to become incredibly successful and wonderful and rule the planet. That means I'm asking you on behalf of my 7-year-old daughter to please level the playing field as rapidly as you can. Now, there are some concrete things you can do now. You can look at your hiring processes now. You can look at the reporting that you have within your organisation around gender parity in terms of pay. If you don't have that reporting, then actually there's an argument that only large organisations can afford to do that. It's not complex. So there's a call to arms that sits within that. But also more broadly, in terms of influencing the next generation, you have an opportunity as leaders in business and leaders in an incredibly influential part of business to either club together or influence individually what the next generation see, feel and believe about what the opportunities are for them. So I'm very lucky in that I have a daughter who will happily slice the head off of My Little Pony with a lightsaber, which I think is, embracing both sides very well. But there is no doubt that expectations around creativity, expectations around roles are set incredibly early in our education system. So for all of the women in this room, be role models for the next generation coming up. And for all of the men in this room, champion women as role models in organisations, but also do your part by ensuring fairness. Because actually, if we accept that there is inherent unfairness in an economy or in a business day in, day out, and do nothing about it, we are complicit with that. And there is no getting away from that. So the idea that this stuff is complicated, I think, gets us away from the fact that, in fact, some of it is very simple, which is that you pay people what they're worth. And if you do that, and that operates across all levels of diversity and inclusion, then you start reaching a better place. The second thing is, or my final point would be, there's a thinker in the US called Joe Gastantz who talks a lot about diversity and inclusion. And he makes a lovely distinction between the two, which is that diversity is counting people and inclusion is making people count. And to do the latter, to help people really feel as though they count and they're part of an organisation and they are welcome and their ideas are welcome, which is what we're talking about in terms of diversity here, you need to do a few things. And that is really understand the psychology of teams and really understand how people come together, how they create, make ideas, and also how you silence people's voices in organisations. Because if you don't understand how you silence people, it's very difficult to understand how you give them a voice. If you come into an organisation and everyone else looks different from you, acts in a different way, the natural human instinct is to attempt to be more like them, to fit in, and to form part of that culture. And that's the inherent challenge that HR practitioners have, and indeed anyone running a business, which is, for years now, people have been saying, hire for fit. Well, it's very difficult to hire for fit and diversity at the same time. It's just a tricky job, and it's not impossible to reconcile those two. But what you need to do is hire for fit into an organisation that embraces diversity. So I said that I would finish on 9 minutes 45 seconds, and I was told that I would get a beer if I did that. So without further ado, I'd like to draw things to a close. Thank you very much.
Quick question. Do you still encounter organisations that are basically in denial about the work they still need to do about gender equality, or do you encounter a lot of businesses that recognise and accept they still have a lot of work to do but they're not there yet?
I encounter the lion's share of businesses that I come into contact with are not short of initiatives. What they are short for, I think, is genuine commitment to. There is a huge difference between appointing someone in your organisation to look after it or having a raft of things that you can point to if you're questioned about it and genuinely being serious about resolving it. The organisations I know that are passionate about resolving it have actually done some really far-reaching things. I know organisations that have genuinely just equalised everyone's pay. The organisations that pay lip service to it put together really nice PowerPoints, but they still have the same issues. I spoke to a major bank probably about a year ago, and they genuinely didn't understand why every woman coming up through the organisation couldn't just rely on their nanny so that they could, stretch their hours out. And that's because actually, if you go to the top echelons of some of the organisations in this country, it's almost an all white male board. The wives don't work, and they have full-time childcare. And it therefore becomes almost impossible for them to understand the career challenges that actually still these days predominantly women face.
Thank you.
Can I just say, Anne, I know you put your hand up to say, we're proud, equal pay. Just very quickly tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, to me it's irrelevant, the gender. It's the individual and it's the role that they play within the business. So it's irrespective of what they do. It's the benefit that they bring to the business. Yeah.
And obviously it's important for you to promote that.
Totally.
And David, just before you go, sorry, we've had a question on Twitter. It's more really that someone missed the authors' names of the books you mentioned. If you could just mention the books and the authors again, please. Yeah, so
there's a book called Ready Player One, and the second one's called The Y-Axis, WHYAXIS, and then it's Urinizi, URI. This is a real test. I should have gone for an easier book. It's by Steve Phillips. No, URIGNEEZY. And that's really worth a look. He did a lot of the work that sits behind other things like Freakonomics and Dan Pink's work. He actually did the research in the field for that. Thank you.